predecessor, he launches the first organized citizen consultation exercise in 1968. It's called it eventually produces a report that's called Foreign Policy for Canadians, but it was a deliberate attempt to wrest control over Canada's foreign policy agenda out of the Mandarins in the Department of External Affairs, and to bring citizens directly into that process. I just participated in a conference at Massey College commemorating 100 years of Pierre Trudeau's birth. I can't remember if he was born in 1919 or 1920, but anyway, he wouldn't be 100 years old if he was alive today, and there was quite an active debate about whether this foreign policy review in 1968 really changed things or not. But what was clear was that Pierre Trudeau had ambitions for us to really change tack and to have a different foreign policy, and he engaged Canadians as allies in that process, regular everyday citizens. Similarly, in 1993, so post-Cold War, we've got another Liberal Party coming to government again under Jean Chrétien, and with particularly active Minister Lloyd Axworthy involved as well. There's a determination to seize the opportunity to rethink Canadian foreign policy and take things in a different direction. And yet again, they choose a foreign policy review, engaging citizens directly as their mechanism to do that. The lesson, I think, from Canadian foreign policy history is that if you want significant change in foreign policy, and particularly if you want to go from a position of less to more ambition, you cannot do it unless you bring citizens directly. Now, to lay out the case that we need more ambition in 2020, let me offer some reflections from a conference that we recently had a week after the election. So we've just had a federal election in Canada in 2019. I think it was quite disappointing to many of us who were interested in foreign policy and international affairs that there was very little content related. There was very little debate, very little discussion about foreign policy. Obviously, the Monk debates had invited the leaders to have a foreign policy debate, as they had done in 2015, and the Prime Minister declined. To the extent that there was much discussion about foreign policy, and much of it was centered around a significant proposal to reduce Canada's ambition in international affairs by cutting our international development budget, a proposal by Andrew Scheer of the Conservatives. So the CIC decided to do something about this. We organized a major conference exactly a week after the election, as some parties were licking their wounds and others were preparing for a new mandate in government, to say our foreign policy shouldn't be left up to civil servants or elected officials alone, that we in Canadian society have a significant role to play. So the way we organized this is we thought of all the various sectors of Canadian society or the Canadian economy that could potentially have a role in projecting our influence overseas, and we invited them to a day-long series of reflections on Canadian foreign policy, and we used the opportunity that we were actually 100 years since the Paris Peace Talks. 1919 was when Canadian foreign policy, independent foreign policy, was born. So in 2019, we decided to celebrate the 100 years of that as a way of thinking in longer historical terms. Where have we come over the last 100 years, and where might we go? I was pleased to see that we had some pretty significant people across the political spectrum. So we had, on the Liberal side, we did actually have Lloyd Axworthy, and some other significant Liberals, but we had some Conservatives as well. The keynote was provided by Brian Mulroney, who had the opportunity to talk about his foreign policy record as Prime Minister. We had Joe Clark. We actually had 5 former foreign ministers in the room, so the politicians were well represented. We had business leaders as well, from the Chamber of Commerce and from the Business Council of Executives. Some significant civil society leaders and activists, and then Canadians in prominent positions overseas. So we actually had Mark Carney, who doesn't represent Canadian government now, but he plays a pretty significant role in international affairs, as the now former governor of the Bank of India. And we did things a little bit differently in that we organized pitches, almost like a sort of Dragon's Den style, where people that had ideas of how we could change our foreign policy could get up on stage and, in the course of just 6 minutes, lay out what their idea was, And then actively invite the participants in the conference to meet with them afterwards to undertake planning for how they would bring that idea together. And then we broadcast everything on CBC Ideas. We have the link if anyone's interested in the podcast on the CIC website, and it's a 1-hour condensation of the conference, and I highly recommend it. So over the course of the day, we heard from 3 perspectives. Perspectives that you could describe as the various schools of thought about international relations and Canadian foreign policy. So we heard from the liberal internationalists, we heard from the realists, and we heard from some of the marginalized voices in Canada. Each one of them, I thought, had a really compelling way of describing what's happening in the world. Each one of them extremely alarmed at the direction international affairs are taking, and each one of them advocating for a significant increase in ambition. All advocating different proposals owing to their different perspectives. But just to summarize what kinds of arguments we heard around the table on October 28th. For the liberal internationalists, and I count myself as this, almost all practicing diplomats or former diplomats tend to be liberal internationalists, in that we believe that it's possible for different states of the world to identify shared interests, that we're not doomed to internal competition. We can also find ways of collaborating, and then we can build institutions and uphold rules or norms of behavior that incentivize shared interests. A liberal internationalist would argue that the prosperity and the security that we have enjoyed over the last 70 years depend very directly and very much on the norms and institutions of the rules-based international order established in the wake of the Second World War. So to the extent that we depend on international trade and investment to enjoy the quality of life, the prosperity that we have today, those are based on rules that govern trade and investment in the international realm. To the extent that we depend on alliances to protect Canadian territory and our security, those are also institutions of the rules-based international order. And yet since 2016, with the arrival of power of leaders of countries, both friends and foes, as it were, that are actively hostile towards the rules of the rules-based international order and actively working to undermine those institutions, we, as a nation, are in hot water. So think about the institutions that uphold our prosperity. NAFTA, we have President Trump, who called it the worst deal ever, and in the midst of our negotiations actually threatened the quote-unquote ruination of Canada. Now we got through that. Our governments negotiated a renewal of NAFTA that's very close to the original, but that was not a foregone conclusion, and there was quite a lot of anxiety that we would get through that. Of course, it's not entirely put to bed yet. But think about the World Trade Organization. It hasn't got nearly as much traction, but the World Trade Organization is on the verge of becoming a completely useless organization. Partially because President Trump has refused to appoint judges for the arbitration panels, and without any kind of ability to arbitrate trade disputes, there's no enforcement of WTO rules, and if there's no enforcement, then the rules themselves will start to become meaningless. Think about other countries too that are actively disintegrating from their neighbors' economies. Think about Brexit, United Kingdom. Perhaps the Johnson government will be able to negotiate new deals which will allow Britain to remain as heavily integrated as it is now in the economies of Europe, but that's a big if. And the 2 largest economies in the world, US and China, the shared trade between them has been a tremendous motor of economic prosperity across the world and the overall growth of global GDP over the last 20 or 25 years. There's now a determined effort to decouple those economies. We've entered a period of deglobalization. Some critics of globalization will say, great, that was not a great period, so let's have less of it. But the fact is that GDP growth over the last 20 to 30 years has been very directly tied to the integration of our economies. Now that our economies are disintegrating, that's likely to have a serious impact on our prosperity. And then to look in terms of norms, the tremendous conflict, the tremendously destructive conflict in Syria, left unchecked, partially because of exhaustion over the attempt to limit the destructive power of civil wars. There was, I think, an honest attempt, if many people criticize it, to promote humanitarian intervention, to limit the destructive power of civil conflicts in the 1990s and in the first decade of the 2000s. But by the time the civil war came to Syria, that collective willpower that we have on the international stage to try and limit that kind of violence has disappeared, and as a result, there are hundreds of thousands of dead in Syria. In my own experience in Venezuela, the attempt to uphold international norms of human rights and democratic governance became a lonelier and lonelier exercise. And even at a country that's considered the epicenter of the democratic revolution in Latin America, the very first country to overthrow the yoke of military dictatorship in the 1950s, and the kind of beacon of hope for human rights activists throughout the 1970s and 80s, obviously then entered into a period of economic collapse and tremendous inequality and dissatisfaction, which reasons that Venezuela got to where it is now, that the light of human rights and democracy is more or less extinguished in Venezuela, even in the heart of the Americas. Norms have also begun to lose any salience over the use of weapons of mass destruction. So there are now chemical weapons being deployed by Russia in British territory, with assassinations using weapons of mass destruction. And of course, the United States has felt no restriction to assassinate a major military leader of a sovereign state in Iraqi territory, also over the last 2 weeks. The norms that constrained violent behavior in the international system are disappearing. And then just think about nuclear weapons. Over the last few years, the United States and Russia have withdrawn from every single nuclear arms treaty that ended the Cold War. There's only one left, and it's START, and it expires in a few months, and the very strong likelihood is that START will also be abandoned. And so that all of the instruments that were designed to limit the growth of nuclear weapons, which was a tremendous focus of international relations throughout the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, will be right back into the nuclear arms races that we used to have. And of course, NATO, if there's any one institution that we depend on for our protection, it's that commitment under Article 5 of NATO to the mutual defense of one another's countries. And of course, we now have a US president who openly questions whether Article 5 has any binding power whatsoever. So liberal internationalists have plenty of reasons to be very, very worried about Canada's interests. Our former Foreign Minister, Chrystia Freeland, was quite eloquent in her defense of the rules-based international order. But for those rhetorical commitments, the only tangible initiative that's resulted from that is something called the Alliance for Multilateralists. An interesting initiative to have countries that share liberal democratic values align their voting patterns in multilateral institutions. But I think many liberal internationals join me in thinking that the solution falls far short from the scale of the problem that we face. We heard from the realists in October as well. So for Canadians that believe that the cornerstone of our security has been a very close reliance with the United States for many, many years, now worries about the fraying bilateral relationship, worries about the rise of China, which has evolved from being a very significant trading partner in which we've agreed to disagree on issues related to politics and human rights, which has practiced growing systematic human rights abuses in its own territory, particularly against Muslims in Xinjiang province. Now obviously quite a serious situation in Hong Kong. I've been experimenting with the use of technology for social control in ways that's very frightening for people that care about civil liberties, and of course is building the infrastructure that many people think will power the Internet of Things, 5G technologies, where the leading company to build 5G around the world is Huawei. Canada, of course, arrested an executive of Huawei following an extradition request by the United States, and that brought us into very direct confrontation with China. I've mentioned the two Michaels already, but it's also had a pretty significant impact on the investment relationship with China. And I think it's an increasingly small group of Canadians that believe that we are ever going to return to a normal, positive relationship focused primarily on trade and investment with China. Add to that a difficult relationship with India, a difficult relationship with Russia, and you have foreign policy experts like Jocelyn Coulon of the University de Montréal saying that Canada's alone in the world. If you think of the four most powerful countries in the world, Canada's got really quite difficult relations with each of them. And we heard also from champions of pluralism and diversity and marginalized voices in Canadian foreign policy. I was proud to see quite a strong representation by First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities in our discussion about Canadian foreign policy. There was also quite an active promotion of the role that diaspora communities can play in connecting Canada in the world. We had Canada's Ambassador for Women, Peace and Security highlighting some of the work that's been done to try and bring the voices of women fully into the fold of Canada foreign policy making. And to some extent, we had our full linguistic diversity on display as well. The one thing that united all three of these various schools of thought is that Canada faces a degree of threat that we have not faced in many, many years, and that the response must be greater attention paid to international affairs and greater investment in international affairs, whether you believe that should go to the military or development assistance or expanding our diplomatic presence. The one thing that everyone agreed on is that the current level of effort in foreign policy is not sufficient. So if so many Canadians agree that Canada should be more ambitious in international affairs, that we should be expanding our attempt to have an impact in the world, what stops us? I'd like to point out three. The first, of course, is that not all Canadians agree on what we should be more ambitious, that the various societal pressures for more ambitious operating across purposes. So one of the tensions that was on display in the October federal election, of course, was between certain regions in Canada, I think primarily Quebec, where there's a real reticence to engage in any greater development of oil and gas resources, increasing opposition to pipelines, and then other parts of Canada, including especially the prairies, that are becoming more and more emphatic in the imperative of building pipelines. So there's obviously like some zero-sum issues where it's not obvious where Canada will be more ambitious in climate change or more ambitious as an energy superpower. We can't do both things at once. That's one constraint that we face. A second is that there's inevitably other things that a government needs to do. There are some domestic priorities that we need to fund. Two of the principal parties are actively exploring ways to fund a national pharmacare program, and the money's going to come from somewhere. And so, can we provide pharmacare and increase our development assistance budget? There's obviously a bit of a zero-sum game there. And of course, you had one party that wanted to just return money to citizens themselves. What really struck me as different from the sheer approach to foreign policy compared to, say, the Harper government or the Mulroney government was that it wasn't that the resources going to projecting Canada's influence should be directed to different instruments, like away from aid and towards military. It was that they should just be withdrawn and sent back to citizens, that we should have less Canada in the world. And so that's an important constraint as well. I believe, though, that there is a potential grand bargain to be struck between the various communities in Canada that are arguing for greater ambition, even if there isn't already an existing consensus about where those resources should go. And I think where that grand bargain lies is in the development of a more independent foreign policy. We are not a middle power anymore, not necessarily because we have any more power than we did in the past, but the concept of middle power refers to a structure of international relations in which we could exercise power partially by being part of alliance with NATO and the United States, in which we drew from the power of our partners in that alliance, but we also had enough independence within it. That's the John Holmes kind of conception of a middle power. John Holmes, the head of the CIA, who popularized the concept of the middle power in the 1960s. When you don't have those alliance structures or that Cold War context anymore, it doesn't make sense to use the concept of middle power. We should be members of institutions and alliances, but many argue that we need to think of ourselves as a principal power, not as a great power. We're not obviously competing with the United States, but that we take on the issues that are at the top of the international agenda. We don't look for the sort of safe niches where no one else is really paying much attention, so we can really kind of distinguish ourselves there. There are fundamental problems facing Canada's national interests, and we should be addressing them frontally. We are the 10th largest economy in the world, so it's not like we're an insignificant player. And we do have a military that can deploy a full-scale battalion, 2 full-scale battalions in 2 different theaters on a permanent basis. So we also are not without means, even at the relatively modest level of investment that we have already. So I do think that we should be, there's a common meeting ground in developing more of an independent foreign policy. I think there's also a greater meeting ground if we start to use the language of impact and power. Not to say that we're ignoring values, but that we are trying to step away from the use of foreign policy as primarily a nation building or a national identity strengthening function, which has been a part of Canadian history for as long as we can remember, and using international affairs more as a way of changing outcomes beyond our borders, much more on impact. And I believe we should actually embrace the language, even if we're not realists. We should. I don't associate myself with that school of thought, but I do think that the language of power is a useful way for us to think about what Canada's trying to accomplish. We want outcomes to be changed outside of our border, and that requires capacities, and that requires a focus on interests. Now, this is going to require a very different kind of diplomacy than what we've seen in the Canadian government. So just to touch briefly on what I think needs to be different in the way that the Canadian government approaches international government that propose policies and implement policies. In global affairs right now, it's more or less the same people that are both proposing the policies and implementing them, and that creates a kind of closed box. And in my experience, having been out of that box, that also dramatically reduces ambition. Because if you're always thinking about what it's going to be like to implement, you're never going to be terribly ambitious with what you propose. You're going to make sure that you keep the resources going, you keep the budgets going, you keep your staff more or less the same way they are. There's a disincentive to ambition if you're not separating those two. I think there's a much greater role for Parliament, and I would actually argue parties. That does lead to the possibility of more partisan debates, but parties themselves are creatures of society in that they bring regular citizens together to try and reach common agreement on what changes need to be happen. And then there are opportunities, whether it's in Parliament or in media, for these competing perspectives to be hashed out. And in that competition of ideas, I think you see some benefit in that some of the weaker ideas will be weeded out, and some of the more genuine common ground found. I think we need to bring the policy debate into the open, partially to withstand the pressures of public debate, because eventually citizens are going to debate this. And citizens are far more informed than they ever were before, thanks to the internet. Unfortunately, citizens also show an increasing tendency to polarize. So even if that closed box of policy development and implementation in government gets the policies right, and I doubt it that they will, when that then meets the pressure of public opinion, it's just not going to withstand. The policy making process has to be public from the beginning if it's going to stand the pressure of public opinion. I believe that we do need a significant increase in the resources that we devote to both development and the military, and we should be expanding our diplomatic presence. I've unfortunately been involved in the closure of 2 different embassies. Our embassy in Tehran, I was in training to be our head of mission in Tehran in 2012 when the Harper government pulled the plug on that, and I had to readjust my career aspirations as a result. And then, unfortunately, I was the last Canadian ambassador to Venezuela. Not only was the post downgraded after me, but the embassy was closed altogether. And our embassy in Syria was closed. There are all reasons for this, but what we are seeing is a gradual shrinking of Canada's diplomatic footprint as we decide that the costs of being active in the world in some of those environments outweigh the benefits. And I think that calculation only makes sense if you don't have ambition for international affairs. There's no reason why we can't have an embassy in Caracas now. Maduro's in power, Maduro doesn't like it, that's fine. You can have embassies in all kinds of countries where people don't like you. And if you want to understand what's going on there and have any kind of influence, you have to have that embassy there. It just takes ambition. So that's just a brief overview of what I think needs to happen on the government front. But as I say, it shouldn't be just up to government itself. So I believe that we, as an organization, created 92 years ago to bring citizens into the foreign policy making process, have an imperative to do, again, what Sir Robert Borden had in mind when he created us in the 1920s. The most powerful idea that emerged from this conference that I mentioned to you, the one that we had in October, in this pitch competition where people did the sort of Dragon's Den thing, was a pitch made by Prem Beatty. Prem Beatty was a conservative foreign minister in the government of Kim Campbell. He's now the head of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, and he called for a foreign policy review. There's been a lot of commentary in the media recently about how we need a foreign policy review, like Trudeau's in 1968 or Chrétien's in 1993. Some have called for a royal commission. Roland Paris, for example, the distinguished University of Ottawa professor, has said we should appoint a panel of eminent persons, of people with deep expertise in international affairs. We should send them across the country to engage with Canadian citizens, take their input, maybe do deep dives in a few areas of real controversy, like what do we do with our relationship with China, and then develop a report that lays out a blueprint for what the new foreign policy would be. The consensus in our conference was that's just not going to happen with a minority government. There's just not enough political bandwidth, essentially, for the Trudeau government to undertake a sort of root branch rethinking of our foreign policy. But in the breakouts of our conference, first of all, we let people kind of vote with their feet. We had 6 pitches, and Parent Beatty's was one of them, and then we had sort of different rooms across the Globe Mail Center where we were meeting, and people just voted with their feet. This is where we could tell that Parent Beatty was onto something, because literally 50% of the entire conference was at his one breakout, and it was so many people we couldn't even really have a proper conversation. It was really palpable the enthusiasm, the traction that this idea is getting. And in the course of the breakout, the discussion, the idea was proposed. If a minority liberal government isn't going to be able to take on a full-fledged foreign policy review, why don't we just do it ourselves? So think about the structure of a royal commission. The appointment of eminent people doesn't necessarily mean government. We were able to bring people like Mark Carney and Louise Albo and some really significant First Nations leaders with some interesting ideas about international affairs. Couldn't we in civil society provide a mandate? We obviously can't call it a royal commission because we don't have any connection to the crown, but we're a national organization, so why don't we call it a national commission? We could send them for regional consultations. We've got 16 branches of the CIC across the country, in cities large and small, and English-speaking cities and French-speaking cities, in cities with a bit of a conservative bent, and cities with a bit of a left-wing bent. And I think if we were to have this commission go to the 16 branches of the CIC, including here in Hamilton, I hope, they would get a pretty good cross-section of what Canadians really think about international affairs. We could do some deep dives on some of the critical issues. I mentioned China. Another one I think is development assistance, with this debate being open about whether we really should be doing development assistance at all. Maybe it's a time to rethink development assistance. Some of the current agendas was dreamed up in the 1960s and 70s, and maybe we could have a fundamental rethink of the purpose of development assistance in the 21st century. We have an enthusiastic partner in Karina Gould, the Minister for International Development, who's not quite a local MP, but not far from here. She's an enthusiastic partner of this. And then we could create a report and we could present that publicly and possibly create the kind of pressure where a federal government feels forced to respond to the content of that kind of report. So that is what the CIC and our partner in organizing this October event called Global Canada, led by Robert Greenhill, the former president of CETA. That's what we intend to do over the course of 2020. We are going to run a national commission to rethink Canada's foreign policy. We're going to bring Canadians from coast to coast into this process. We are going to generate some new ideas, generate some public discussion through media partnership, and then we're going to present that to the Government of Canada and to all the various parties. Let me close, because I would love to take some questions from all of you on what you can do. We've talked a little bit about what the government can do, what CIC is doing, but we see a role for every single Canadian. Any Canadian who's interested in national relations could potentially play a role. The most basic and the easiest, and the thing that I hope everyone in the room will do today, is to join the CIC. We are a national organization, so in addition to attending events like this, you tap into a whole community of people across our country that care deeply about our international relations. We connect the discussions that we're having across these cities, and I think Paul would probably agree with me in saying that when you're part of the CIC and having our conversations with people in Saskatoon and Victoria and Quebec City and soon to be Whitehorse, you really get a sense that we are participating in something national. We are having conversations on average every second day across this country with citizens who care about international affairs. It costs $75, $20 if you're a student, and so we would really welcome you as members of the CIC, and you can join by going to our website. A second thing, and particularly for those of you in Hamilton, this is a branch with a long and distinguished history in originally the CIA and now the CIC. You've got a phenomenal leader in Paul, who's done a great job in organizing this. Today is also a member of our national board, and so very, very connected with all of the strategic discussions that we're having. And there are vacancies on the board, on the executive of the CIC. Some cities have as many as 12, 16. I think Victoria even has 20 people on its executive. And so there's quite a lot of space to grow the executive. Generally the way it works, because this is a volunteer organization, is the more the people that are involved, the more events that you can organize, and the more value that the people of Hamilton draw from this. So I was very pleased to call on Paul's behalf to those of you that care about the role of citizens in foreign policy, want to be part of this community and want to help build it, to help join the executive of CIC Hamilton. Third, we've got a national organization to build as well. We have a national office in Toronto, the one that I lead, alongside Daniel here, who's our programming coordinator, my colleague Nikolai. It's a small but mighty team. And we are going to be hosting this extremely ambitious exercise over the next year of identifying some group of eminent people to rethink Canadian foreign policy, to send them across the country, to produce a report and organize another event where we present it to government, and we could use some support in building the national. That will take volunteers, that will also take resources, and so we have some ambitious fundraising plans, and anyone who has ideas or relationships or partnerships to propose that would help build this national institution to fulfill the vision that Sir Robert Borden had for us, we would be extremely enthusiastic about that. As citizens, I think each of us also have an opportunity to engage in the conversation. We provide that opportunity because in addition to events like this and some of the research that we commission, the research our fellows do that offer the opportunity to go deeper into the issues of international affairs, we provide opportunities to share your own opinions through our social media. I'll be taking some questions later on from our live stream audience who will be joining us. But we're also active in Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram. Instagram, thanks to Lexi, who set up our our account over the course of the summer, so that we can engage in all different age groups in Canada. And so we'd encourage you to use the opportunity that CIC provides to share your own opinions. But obviously not just the CIC. Roy and I are also part of a book club where we meet every 2 months to talk about populism. And I think that kind of initiative where you reach out to citizens, other fellow citizens, neighbors, colleagues, and have the discussions about the big issues that are facing us. I encourage everyone to subscribe to a Canadian newspaper because it's important to have Canadian sources of information about what's happening in the world, and an opportunity for Canadians to debate what our role. And so whatever your local newspaper, your preferred TV or radio channel, become part of that as well. And then as citizens, we should do more than just be part of the conversation. I think we should get involved. Each of us have our own sets of issues that we care about. So find an NGO or a church group or another religious group that advocates some of those issues and get involved in it. We should be involving our local MPs in our events and reaching out to elected officials. And as I said earlier, I think parties have an important role to play. So those of you that have a particular perspective about which set of ideas should emerge in the public realm, I think we should all be members of a political party, and we should all be working to build up that capacity for citizens to engage and influence what's going on. So just to end off where I started out with the reflection on our 57 fellow citizens that died as a result of conflict in the Middle East earlier this week. We don't know which of us will be caught up in international affairs in the years to come. The chances are that some of us will. And I think we owe it to those, just as we owed it to the soldiers that had made those sacrifices in the First World War, to get more serious about international affairs and to increase our own engagement, to try and shape what's happening around the world and not just be shaped by it. We owe it to them, we owed it to the ones that we lost more recently, and we owe it to those that might pay that price in the future to be more ambitious about Canada's role in the world, and I invite you to be a part of it.
Thank you very much.
I'd be happy to take any questions that you have, either about what I've presented or about other issues in Canadian foreign policy and international relations. And I'll also take any questions that have appeared up there. Just feel free to.
You have a question here, Rory?
Maybe just to start off also because I have to run. My thought is, where do you start with a foreign policy review? How do you get past for me, I see this long-standing false dichotomy between those who think we need to invest more in hard security in the military, those who believe in the United Nations. How do we get outside of that or how can what CIC does through the build towards getting outside of that box that we've been sort of fighting internally for all this time?
Yeah. So we have a agreement on the challenges that China's new approach to Canada poses, and that should provide some common ground. I did mention earlier that Canadians are showing some tendency to polarize. That just seems to be the structure of public debate mediated through digital communications now, that we're kind of encouraged to stick with our filter bubble. But if I had a hopeful note to sound, it would be that of all the nations in the world, we're the least polarized. Certainly having spent 4 years in Venezuela, but even the United States, you look at Britain, the debate over Brexit, like these are countries where it's actually now become almost impossible to have a rational debate with people across the spectrum. I don't yet see that in Canada. There's certainly some issues that divide us, there's some opinions that other Canadians have that can really boil your blood and make you angry, and yet there's an ability that I think most Canadians retain to have that conversation with each other. And what I'm hoping we can do is to actually expose Canadians that have opposite opinions to each other, to kind of be the anti-filter bubble. You know, the CIC, we do have an online component, but really this is the main activity of the CIC, is to bring people together face to face. And when people are face to face, there's a different kind of social interaction that you have online. And so I think by actually having these face-to-face conversations would be one way for us. We'd also give it time. too. This is not going to be a sort of quick fix. We're looking at really dedicating the full year to this kind of stuff. Okay. Oh, yes.
I think a lot of Canadians were terribly disappointed in the political debates that led up to the election.
Yeah.
The inability of any politician to put his point of view across without being interrupted to the point that you really didn't know who was saying what. And it seems to me that in order for us to effectively have this kind of discussion, that we somehow or other have to get the political parties on side. And I'm wondering if you've given any thought to how we might go about doing that.
Yeah, it's a great question. I do actually think that, as I mentioned at the beginning, voters do care about foreign policy. My hypothesis is that they don't, foreign policy discussions don't emerge in the campaign in a period when policies don't have significant differences in their perspectives. Because of course, in order to gain traction at the polls, you need to be able to differentiate yourself. And you know, for the last several decades, there hasn't been tremendous differences of opinion between, say, progressive conservative Brian Mulroney foreign policy and Chrétien liberal foreign policy. So to the extent that there are different perspectives right now, we should be actually encouraging parties to air their differences, to parliamentarians organize these debates throughout the year where the foreign policy experts in the various parties come together. CIC could feasibly be the group that organizes that debate. $150 million center for democracy support, essentially. They call it the Center for Peace, Order, and Good Government. That's a big, big idea. There's not many new parts of the Canadian foreign policy establishment that have a budget of $150 million, and it was there, but did any of you hear of this come up in the campaign at all? So it's often just that decision by the message control people of the parties not to put things forward. So that would be my approach, would be not to wait till the campaign to get those ideas fleshed out and debated in public beforehand. Yes?
Draw on an analogy of architecture and construction. If you're going to rebuild, which it sounds like you are looking to do, you have the history of the foundation of where you are now based on almost 100-year history. Sometimes it's best to reverse engineer. So if I said we're now 2030, what would you like to look back at and say that you have succeeded in doing in the last decade?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I have an answer too. I would like, by 2030, I'd like there to be twice as many Canadian branches of the CIC. Instead of being in 16 cities, I'd like us to be in 32 cities. I'd like us to have, we have 1,300 members right now. I'd like to have, 5,000, 10,000 members. I'd like the debate about foreign policy to be a more automatic part of the discussion at election time as well, but as part of the ongoing discussion. In our media, for example, the Toronto Star is terrible coverage of foreign policy. So I'd like to see like major news agencies doing a better job of covering what's happening in the world, maybe more foreign correspondence, and I'd like to be able to point back to the influence that the CIC had to make international relations and foreign policy more of the daily debate that we're having in Canada.
Can you give me some specific headline topics? Would you say military? Would you say trade? Would you say, what major topics would you be able to look back and say that you've been able to affect over a decade by the dialogues that you have amongst the individuals?
We have a mandate that prevents us from advocating specific policies, so I can't point to like one specific set because that's just not who we are. Our goal is to involve more citizens. But you could measure our success in those ways. When I was practicing digital diplomacy, we talked a lot about society to society link, traditional diplomacy is state to state. And yet, if you look at the full range of what Canada has to offer the world, only a small part of that is under the purview of the federal government. So I think we would be successful to the extent that everyday Canadians have far more connectivity with the outside world, whether that's with studying abroad or exchanges, professional exchanges as well, sabbaticals where people are living abroad and actively engaged in what's happening abroad, subscriptions to international newspapers, for example. I'd like the international affairs to just be more part of the daily experience that Canadians have. I wouldn't say regardless of the specific changes in the policy, but just that it's a front burner issue. That would inevitably require greater investment by government as well. We're under pressure within NATO to have 2% of our budget go to the military. I think 2% is probably pretty modest. We probably should have a much bigger military. We should have a much bigger development budget as well. And so with that greater government spending, you would also see more of a presence of the instruments of international impact in our daily lives. We have a distinguished Canadian historian of Canadian foreign policy who's associated with us called Greg Donaghy, and this whole debate about what Canada's contribution to military spending should be. He said, this whole debate over 2% is quite ahistorical, because in the 1950s, what we think of as the kind of heyday of Canadian diplomacy, peacekeeping, middle power, helpful fixer, all of that, our military budget was 9% of our GDP. And that's not to say, to advocate that much greater role, it's not to say we should be engaged in more wars, but it does say that we should be devoting more of our national effort, not just our governmental, our national effort, to the effort to project our influence overseas. Have some questions online?
Yeah, we've got a lot of people actually online. We've got members from Toronto, Victoria, Ottawa, Saskatoon, New York, Vancouver. So there's a lot of excitement in the comments, and we've got some questions.
Hello, internet crowd.
So Anna Tsorkin from Victoria says that she's really excited, and she asks what the methodology will be to provide a relatively equal input from citizens from coast to coast.
Wonderful. Anna is a member of our Victoria branch. She's a Russia expert. She was part of our October events, and also has been traveling to several of our CIC branches across the country to help us understand the Canada-Russia relationship. So we have 16 branches. They're actually not very well distributed across the country. I'm not really sure why, but we are a very Western-centric organization, which is kind of wonderful when you think of it. There's not many national institutions that have 50% of their membership base in one province, in British Columbia. But I can assure you, Anna, BC will be very well represented, because BC plays such an important role in the CIC. When we're looking at regional consultations, if we take this national commission and send it to different places, we're going to make sure that there's adequate coverage. Because we have quite a lot of Western branches, it might mean that they don't go to every single Western branch, and Halifax is almost certainly going to be on the agenda, because we have one in all 4 of our Atlantic provinces. But we are going to want to make sure that we've got a mix of the various regions of Canada in the hosting of these events. And also, I'd like to have a real diversity of the size of the city. One thing that I'm particularly excited about the CIC, we're not just in Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver, we're also in North Bay. We're going to be in Whitehorse soon, a city of less than 50,000 people. And I think it's really essential that we get the voices of Canadians from small communities. I don't know if we can quite say that we have representation in rural Canada, because if you're in Whitehorse, you're still in a city, but we'd really like to get that kind of diversity. And then we're also hoping there'll be a major online component of this, and that's also something that can be measured and, if necessary, kind of rebalanced. So if we're seeing really active participation by those of us in Ontario, let's make sure that we're hearing from some of the other provinces as well.
I'm being reminded in the comments that Calgary and Saskatoon are also watching, so not to leave them out.
Okay.
Chrétien Zari from Saskatoon wants to add on to Anna's question and asks any ideas on the tools that are going to be used as part of the review, and is this going to be an online conversation and input, or are there going to be physical meetings?
I would like to have both physical and online. As I mentioned to Rory when he was here, I think you get a very different kind of discussion when it's in person. You're able to air diametrically different opposing views and to have some genuine discovery of where the middle ground is in person. Very difficult to do that online. And yet the real advantage of online is you can involve way, way more people. I mean, we have about 20 people involved in the discussion here, and probably as many online. But you could potentially get to tens of thousands of people participating if you do it through an effective use of digital communications. Digital communications also offer some interesting ways of parsing through a large number of opinions. You can have online polls, you can have iterative discussions where different proposals are kind of filtered through various cycles in a discussion to see which one really emerge most powerfully. And so ideally what we would be doing is having a constant interaction between physical events that are happening in many places across the country and an online space where those inputs are being kind of constantly collated and reassessed and then regurgitated to the in-person discussions, so that you're really having a genuine national conversation. Any more questions in the room? Yes, please.
Just, I guess, to add on to this demographics conversation a little bit more, I'm wondering to what extent the project is looking to commit itself to ensuring equality across representation. So we've heard a lot about geographically how that would be done.
Yeah.
But my concern is, as a student of international relations, it's fairly obvious that historically foreign policy and international relations have favored very specific demographics for a very long time.
Like
And
my demographic in particular.
Potentially, but this is my second branch of the CIC I've been to. I come from the Victoria branch, which is quite a large one, and very fortunately has had a large growth in its younger population. But it's not hard to note that someone like me is not common in a room like this.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's important that the younger generation, to be interested and remove their apathy, is involved, especially as Canada is devoting itself to a feminist foreign policy.
Mm-hmm.
What can we do as the CIC to make sure that this initiative is truly representative of Canadians as a whole?
So we probably need to do many things in order to bring in the voices of many communities.
Mm-hmm.
For young people in particular, we have sparked a conversation between young professionals, so not students so much, but people in the first, say, 5 to 10 years of their careers, and offered resources for them, if they choose, to create a young professionals network. This is being spearheaded by some executives in our Calgary, Edmonton, and Toronto branches, although open to anyone else that are interested. And I would like to invite the Young Professionals Network itself to generate a single report to feed into the National Commission, so that there is a concrete or a discrete input that's clearly from people of that generation, not just percolating through the various geographic discussions. The other dimensions of diversity that we're anxious to include are visible minorities, and there we had a really exciting proposal at our October conference to engage diaspora communities more actively. Given the deep expertise the diasporas from a particular country have about that particular country, this is something that the foreign policy establishment has tended to shy away from, because diaspora people tend to have very intensely held views about things. And yet, I have found in my own practice of diplomacy that diasporas are incredibly valuable partners in foreign policy development. I think about the Venezuelan community here in Canada that have been so stalwart in supporting the government's efforts in foreign policy, and I would love to be able to engage with all the diaspora communities and to make sure that each one of them feels that there's a place at the table. And then, of course, I mentioned First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities, and there again, there's a completely different dynamic. Diaspora communities, you're likely to reach a lot of them in the really big cities. It's kind of the opposite for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities, that we're really going to have to go out of our way to go to some pretty out-of-the-way places in order to engage those voices. And so we're looking for particular partners that will be able to help us introduce. There's also kind of a potential gap of trust between First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities and organizations like ours, which have been, largely pretty white and male and older. And so we're conscious that we're going to have to make some pretty determined steps in order to bring in that full diversity of voices. But conversely, this is also what really excites me about having this kind of foreign policy review process done outside of government, inside our organization. And I think there's more scope for us to engage with communities than the government is sometimes able to, because there's so much more at stake. Like if you're a diaspora group meeting with the government, then there's like real pressure to advocate like a particular line, whereas if we're at sort of one remove from government, I think that might actually open up the space for a much more comprehensive and serious commitment to the full diversity of Canadians. Thank you. Let me take one here, and then Lexi, and then we've got others online.
Yeah, just writing on this, I wondered if it might be, if you want a structure to facilitate this, having SIG groups, special interest groups set up, categories of interest that are formally set up within the CIC, that this might be a way of doing this.
Special interest groups, structured along which lines did you have in mind?
Well, the liberal internationalists might
like
be a
the
special
schools of
interest
thought.
group. The realists might be a special interest group. The young people might be a special interest group. Various diaspora communities. And so we have some kind of set of pigeonholes where people can get together of a similar view, and then somehow we collate this and come up with a presentation to government or whoever we want to speak to. But it would provide a structure into which information could be organized.
Yeah, I suppose. It occurs to me some of those, if you segment out some of those, there's going to be a debate between them as well. Which I suppose is not necessarily a bad thing if you have the liberal internationalists kind of criticizing the realists and back and forth.
Conflict is probably a very good thing.
And, yeah, I suppose it might be.
I subscribe to foreign affairs, which I'm sure you're familiar with. And very often they will run back to back opposing views.
Yeah.
And so the clarity of the view, the strength of the view, they're free to express that.
Yeah, that's true.
And generally comes with the right thing. I mean, I don't see how life works if you don't have conflict.
Yeah.
It's whether you have respect in the conflict that we would have to insist on.
Yes, that's true. In fact, that actually could be a great way to just attract more eyeballs to the whole process too. That if you're highlighting specific issues or perspectives that are starting to really conflict with each other, you can actually invite third parties into that discussion and say, well, here's one perspective and here's another, and then invite people to
I
share
mean, that's a
their views as well.
respectable form of forming truth. The dialectic, thesis, antithesis, synthesis.
Yeah, that's right. I like that. That's great. What was your question, Lexi?
So to build up on the previous conversation about diversity and also especially about engaging young Canadians, for example, university students, it is pretty evidential that there is an increasing number of university students with a diversity of academic backgrounds that are actively looking for opportunities to voice their opinions about foreign policies, Canadian policies. So I'm wondering, I want to take this opportunity to ask the CIC, how can us, the young Canadians, especially university students, play a part in the proposal, I guess the initiative of this national policy, foreign policy review, and to be a part of this conversation and to join this initiative?
Well, thank you. Maybe I can ask you a question as a university student. Lexi's a second-year business student at the university, Western University. Would it be a meaningful community to be invited to provide opinion as university students, like across the whole country and across the various different perspectives? Or would it make more sense to be part of smaller communities that have a more specific focus? So, for example, with young professionals, we're inviting everyone that's sort of 23, 24 to 35 to engage together as a group. I'm wondering if that makes sense as an approach for university students.
from a university student's perspective, I see like every university as its own entity.
Mhm.
So in that sense, I could totally see that if there are individuals on certain campus that are actively involved in the conversation, it could easily encourage others on their campus to join the conversation and increase the size of this group, to have more people, at least from the certain region, like this particular university to join, to have its own organization.
You do it by campus by campus.
Campus
and
by campus,
Not
and
just
then
like all university students together.
no, I think it will be more effective to
Yeah.
do it that way from my perspective.
Okay.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion. Thank you. We have some more from online.
We do. Are you up for a challenging question?
Yeah, I like the challenge.
Okay. So we have Zach Bacon from Toronto, and his question is a bit more, well, asking you more to justify the program, and I'll elaborate on what he means. He asks, realists might contend that Canada needs to repair and deepen relations with Russia and China to counterbalance our depending on the U.S. With the possibility that this program might double down on existing foreign policy, why support the program if it could prevent Canada from acting more strategically and diversifying its partnerships on the international stage?
All right. Well, thank you, Zach. Zach is a contributor to Global Brief magazine, which is a great Canadian publication on international affairs, and has a bit of a realist bent, I think, Global Brief. So I appreciate that. I don't actually see why a process engaging citizens would lead us away from realism. I don't know if there's a natural tendency among the general population for one school of thought. Now, if you're going to involve diplomats, you're definitely going to get a liberal internationalist perspective, but this will be precisely, everyone but the diplomats. And I think you would actually get quite a lot of realist perspectives. I think that's becoming a more popular school of thought. I certainly have come across a lot of realist perspectives in some of the public speaking that I've done, and just the argument that Canada should be developing its relations with, further develop its relations with Putin's Russia, has become more of a common. It's more common to hear that argument than before, and so I think that suggests to me that there is actually plenty of space for realist perspectives. We could build on Colin's idea, which would be to actually invite people of a similar perspective, particularly if they see themselves as the kind of minority perspective against the groupthink of the majority, to have their own special forum inside this, either to provide a sort of running critique of where the consensus position is going, or just to stake out a separate position. So if we were to go ahead with this, I'd be quite happy to have a forum for realists to share their perspectives.
Got one more?
Sure, go ahead.
Brett Shearing from Vancouver, president of Vancouver branch, asks how this program will tie in with CIC's research scope.
So the CIC has three business lines, sort of three sets of activities. The first are events, like we're doing right now. I've mentioned also online engagement, and then the third is research. We have a modest fellowship program where we commission research, and those researchers then publish either articles in the International Journal or blog posts on our website. They have been a bit disconnected up until now, that the researchers or the fellows are kind of doing their thing, and then the branches are organizing events, and sometimes there was a connection, but not much. I'd like to bring them into much closer alignment, so we're actually bringing on fellows because of a specific issue area that we want fed into the National Commission or this national conversation. And then as those researchers are writing their piece, we're actually sending them to the branches to be part of the regional conversation. We're experimenting with that right now with the research team that we have on democracy and populism, where we've commissioned a Carleton University professor to write that and write a piece for us. And once he has done so, we're going to be sending him to different branches. But as we sketch out what are the most controversial issues in foreign policy across the board, we're actually just in the process now of starting to call for new fellows and we could target it towards those specific issues to as inputs to this National Commission process. We take maybe one or two final questions.
The only other one I have, I guess, is from David Dement.
All right.
Actually, from Ottawa, and he might have missed this part of the presentation, but he wanted to ask whether this is more in the brainstorming and pre-decision phase to launch a citizen-based foreign policy review, or is it further along?
No, especially as a member of my board of directors, I need to assure you, David, that it's a preliminary discussion, but because it's a process involving public, involving the opinion of citizens, I think it's useful for us to engage in that, to share some of our ideas as it's coming together. Most of our online audiences come from other CIC branches, so that's been an internal discussion to some extent. But I think it's useful for us to start sending sort of smoke signals out there that we're heading in this direction, so that we can gather some of the great ideas that we've had around here and build that into the structure, and to see who other partners might be. In terms of formal decision making, we've had an initial discussion in our board in December, and the mandate provided by the board was to conduct a kind of planning exercise, figure out how much this would cost, where we would generate the revenue for it, what kind of activities would be involved, what would be the role of branches, and then to come back to the board in March, so that we can still get this underway in the course of this of the spring. And final question from Blake.
What you were just talking about in terms of the budgeting of the program, I think is going to be pretty critical to this.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to me that when we talk about having different groups, different viewpoints brought together, then somebody has to sit down and evaluate those and see if there's a consensus. Somebody has to take a heck of a lot of time to do this.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if before this is presented, you'll have some kind of an organizational structure put together as to who would do what would be done voluntarily, what you're going to have to pay for. Because it doesn't seem to me that there's an awful lot of full-time resources available to the CIC. And somebody's going to have to read all of this material. They're going to have to synthesize this, and I'm just questioning what the budget for something of that scope might be.
So we're going to need to have some kind of secretariat, and the secretariat would be the personnel supporting a national commission. The national commissioners probably wouldn't be paid. We imagine this would be a voluntary activity, but the synthesis of the various inputs that are provided are often done by a secretariat, and so we're fleshing out how many that would be. As I mentioned earlier, we wouldn't be doing this alone. There are partner organizations that are interested, and therefore that opens the possibility of pooling of resources. And some of those organizations already have the resources to hand. We don't have a lot already inside the CIC. But after a few weeks of it enough to get started with, and there's some discussions with prospects in our fundraising drive, I think that we'll be able to turn to in short order. But yes, you're right. The amount of resources that we raise really will determine our level of ambition. The number of events that we have to do on every single CIC branch, that's a lot of travel for whoever the commissioners are. So we might not be able to get to all 16. And the number of issues that we take on, and the size and scope of the event where this is proposed, those will all be variables that we'll have to either ramp up or ramp down in ambition depending on how much fundraising we do. And that's why my principal objective over the coming 2 months will be a fundraising drive. So we can know going into this how much ambition we have. And if any of you have any leads to suggest for us, please do let us know. We've got quite a professional fundraising operation in Toronto, and essentially we we just need introductions to people that might want to partner with us in this endeavor, and I think we've got an interesting value proposition to offer, and a chance to really shape the discussion that we're having at a national level on what Canada's role in the world should be.
So thank you very much. We really appreciate your diligence and your leadership, Ben, and on behalf of all of us here at the CIC Hamilton, and we really appreciate your time, your passion, and your leadership and direction to our organization. So thank you, and look forward to having a little mingle.
Awesome. Okay, thank you. Thanks for everyone.